our speaker this morning. He was graciously accepted the invitation to come on very short notice, and I really appreciate him taking his time for about a 2-hour drive west over here to Transylvania this morning. And he's probably going to say something about Google Maps. Don't trust Google Maps. But I've learned a lot about him this week on his website. The type of family man that he is, and a very, very successful businessman. I'm not going to steal his thunder because I want him to tell you about himself. But he is running for Congress here in the 11th District for the U.S. House of Representatives. And please make welcome Mr. Vance Patterson.
What a neat group you guys have got. Way to go, Jeremy and Jim and everybody else working in this group. I spoke in Buncombe County last Saturday morning, and half this many people here. So you guys are really doing a good job. And I tell people, often the hardest part is just showing up. Showing up, and then you guys are engaging the process, and this is so important on this local level. This is where it all happens. Last week, I took my wife to a movie Friday night. It was a date night for us. And it was a romantic comedy, and it was a fair movie. It wasn't really that great. But one of the hokey lines in it was, this guy looked at the young lady and said, how does dinner in Milan and breakfast in Paris sound to you? And I kind of rolled my eyes. And so we're walking out of the movie theater, and we're talking about it a little bit afterwards, and I looked at my wife, and with the most romantic voice, I said, how does breakfast in Brevard and dinner in Wayne? That I could still make my wife laugh. That's where we'll be tonight for dinner. I'm going to talk about a crisis that's coming. And you know, over the past 3 years, there have been all kinds of crises coming out of this administration. But the crisis I'm talking about dwarfs these others in its direct impact on you and your families. It's an economic crisis. An economic crisis that can threaten our standard of living, our leadership role in the world, and the quality of life for our future generations. Those generations are going to look back on us and say, what were you thinking to allow such a thing to happen? Such a mess after your parents left you such a wonderful America. Our economy tanked 3 years ago, and it's been flat ever since. Do you know that 9 of the last 11 recessions lasted less than a year? And this one's been going on 3 years now. They'll say, some people will say that there's a slow, jobless recovery going on. Well, what good is that if you don't have a job or you're underemployed? 1 out of 5 people either doesn't have a job or is underemployed right now. And here's the scary part. The massive debt we've been accumulating, a debt that is still growing by $1 trillion a year. That debt hadn't hit yet. And Obamacare doesn't kick in until 2013. When that massive debt hits and Obamacare hits, what economic activity we've got going is going to be crushed. The last time we had an economic crisis like this was back during the Nixon-Ford Carter era. And I know a number of you in here remember that time. It was very difficult. I remember it well. It started in 1970, and it lasted until about 87, 88. It lasted 17 years. I just finished my education in 72. Mary Jo and I got married in 74. We moved 9 times our first 10 years of marriage while I was working to find a job. I started a business in 1979. It lasted 2 years. I lost it in 81. I lost my house. My young wife and I had a 2-year-old, an infant, and she was pregnant again. We had no health insurance. And I still owed the government over $50,000 in back taxes due to business losses. So what did we do? Well, we adapted. We did more with less. We rented and started over. I was 31 years old. What was different back then from what we've got right now? Now, back then we had Unemployment about 11%. Now it's been 9 to 10% for the last 3 years. We had 4 recessions during that period. Each one lasted about a year. This one's been going on for 3 years now. It's going to go longer. The biggest difference was back then we had inflation. If you all remember, inflation is a crippling effect on everybody. Now, the government says don't worry about inflation. It's been running 1 to 2% for the last 3 years. This year it's up to 3%. They say don't worry for the next 2 or 3 years. It's not a problem. Well, I don't know what store they're shopping at. But when I go to the grocery store and I look at the faces of the people that are shopping, they are scared and worried about how they're going to buy this food to put on the table for their families. Bread, milk, eggs, margarine, vegetables, meat, everything is going out of sight. And in the commodity market, that's something I watch. Cotton has gone up 77% in the last year. Corn has gone up 85%. In the metals, copper. Copper is something we use a lot in business. It's gone up 300% in the last 18 months. When these prices work their way through the system, inflation is going to take off. When we get hit with this inflation, we're going to be right back where we were back in the Nixon-Ford Carter era. Inflation ran 15% back then. It's called hyperinflation. Mortgages got up to 17%. I remember manufacturing. Working around the world, I've negotiated all across Europe, in England, Scotland, all the way to Greece, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Dubai, Central America, South America, and in China. And as I've worked in these countries and negotiated business, I've learned the cultures, and culture is so important when you're dealing with other countries. Especially when you're setting up things like NAFTA, these trade agreements. You've got to know their culture. Something our government didn't know when they set up NAFTA. Example, I did a joint venture to manufacture our products over in Russia. Entered an agreement with a company called MOVED, Moscow Ventilation Company. They were started back in 1937 under the Stalin era. Signed an agreement here and then flew over to Russia by myself to finish the agreement and meet the president of the company and tour the factory. We were going to send our materials over there for final assembly and then distribute throughout Eastern Europe. Well, I entered the negotiations. We spent 3 days talking in this room. There were 8 Russians and me. They had sales, marketing, they had legal, they had accounting, they had the president of the company, an interpreter. We sat in there for 3 days, worked on this agreement. And they would make, and I found out that we weren't even close when I got there. We weren't close to an agreement. We went through this, and as they make a proposal, I have to sit there and think of a counter. Well, I didn't have anybody to talk to, so we'd be sitting there in silence. 30, 45 seconds, and then I'd come back and we'd talk some more. At one point, they made a proposal, and I countered, and they came back to me again, and I didn't have an answer. And I sat there and thought to myself, this isn't going to work. There is no way I'm going to do this. This deal is blown. And after a minute and a half sitting there in silence, I finally pushed back from the table, got up and walked away. And it was the exact right thing to do. The rest of the Russians all stood up and said, yes, we'll take a break. We go into the other room, we ate some hard salami, some bread, some cheese, drank some plum juice, settled down a little bit. I'm big on plum juice. Not bad stuff. So we go back in, we sit down, and we start talking again, and we work out the agreement. And it was on my terms. The agreement lasted 6 years. It was a good agreement. We did good business. This is something our government needs to learn how to do when it's negotiating with other countries. It needs to learn how to push back from the table and walk away. You see, I was the only American in the room. And if I didn't come to agreement with them, the deal was off. And the whole world knows that if you're not dealing with Americans, you're not a global player. Another example, and real quickly, would be down in Brazil, the culture you've got to know. If you and I are sitting down and negotiating, and you leave your camera on the table and go away and come back, and I have your camera, I didn't steal your camera. I was just more clever. You see, before you had your camera, and now I've got it. And in Brazil, that's not stealing. It's just being more clever. And they're not a bunch of, they aren't a bunch of thieves. This is their culture. You need to know this when you're going into business negotiations with them. In China, if I come to an agreement, and you tell me you're going to do something, and then I go home and you don't do it, Well, I shouldn't be surprised, because see, the Chinese are much more interested in saving face than telling you no or going ahead with the agreement. They want to save face for you and save face for me, so they'll say yes, with no intention of doing it. You got to know this. A little more about me. I'm in favor of tax reform. 999, flat tax, fair tax, all are better than the dysfunctional system we've got right now. Bottom line on this is we've got to stop using our tax system for social engineering. And by that I mean, if I want you to do something, I'll give you a tax break. If I don't want you to do it, I'm going to tax you. That is social engineering. And you see it all through our tax system, which is why it's such a dysfunctional mess. I stand strong on the Second Amendment. I've been a gun owner since I was 6 years old. And if I had a right to own a gun when I was 6 years old, how in the world could I not have a right to own a gun now? I believe in term limits. I believe that our founding fathers would be stunned to know there's such a thing as a professional politician. They weren't our founding politicians, they were our founding fathers, with families and homes, and they couldn't wait to get back to them once their work was done. And that's what we need back in Washington now. I promise you, somebody like me, once the work is done, I know where I live, and I want to get back here. I believe in free trade among states and fair trade among countries. Huge difference, something our government didn't know when it set up NAFTA and CAFTA. And I believe we should repeal those and renegotiate them based on what's best for America. Our job in a negotiation is not to save the other country. It's to do what's best for America. Because when America does well, its neighbors do well, and often the rest of the world does well. I believe Obamacare is a violation of the 5th, 9th, and 10th Amendments and should be repealed. I'm in favor of and support the Defense of Marriage Act, and I oppose all forms of abortion. And I'll talk about that if somebody wants to ask about it. Finally, I will stand up to political correctness. And the first stand I'll make is to affirm God in government. Not religion in government, but God in government. G.K. Chesterton was a famous poet back in the 20s and 30s. He wrote, "Once remove the God, and the government becomes the God." Once remove the God, and the government becomes the God. And you can see this happening. The government wants you to come more and more to them for all your needs. And this needs to stop. This coming election should not be a popularity contest. It shouldn't be a beauty contest or even a political contest. It should be a moment of clarity, like Ronald Reagan had back when during the last economic recession, the last economic crisis. He was having all kinds of problems, but he had the vision to see that America's best days were ahead of us. There was strong leadership and a plan and a passion to make it work. He could turn the country around, and he did. We took off and just had an incredible 20 years after Reagan. This election needs to be a moment of responsibility for you all to look at the list of candidates and decide which one is the most qualified. Which one, if you were spending your own money, would you hire to, first of all, step up and confront Representative Schuler on the issues and return this district to a conservative Republican column? And then is that candidate the one most qualified to go to Washington? Stand up to the liberal progressive agenda and the onslaught of this economic crisis and turn things around. You need to hire the person. You need to decide which one is the most qualified. Now, people ask me, why am I running for Congress, U.S. Congress? That's probably the most common question I get, other than where Burke County is. I've got this down to one sentence, because I've gone through my speech and my stump speech and everything and talked to my wife. I've got it down to one sentence. I want to work for my family and serve my country. I've got the creativity to start companies, and that brings jobs. I've got a degree in economics. Together with my 38 years business experience, means I know how the economy works on our level. I've got the knowledge and experience in negotiating nationally and internationally. I've got a good working knowledge of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And I have the foresight to see this economic crisis coming at us, and the passion to step up, confront it, and turn it around. Bottom line, I believe it would be irresponsible, as I've been blessed with these abilities and talents, that it would be irresponsible of me to bury these talents and not use them to work for my family, for your family, and for our future generations. With your support, I'll go to Washington. I'll take on this liberal progressive agenda and the onslaught of this economic crisis. I ask of you to have that moment of clarity, to see the potential that our district still has to turn around with good leadership, good, strong, experienced leadership. We don't have to wait on the rest of the country. We don't have to wait on the rest of the state. We've got the ability to do it now. Manufacturing is coming back, but it's not coming back in the form that it left. There are going to be smaller companies, more focused on niche markets. And the ones that are going to be running these companies are our kids, the Y generation. And you know what they're interested in? Quality of life. That's what we need to attract into our district with. Quality of life. Not big wages, not fancy cities and things like that. They want quality of life. And nobody's got the quality of life like we've got here in the 11th district. As I've traveled the world, I tell people, they say, where do you live? I say, North Carolina. They say, oh, what part? I say, near Asheville, the western part. Oh, I hear that's so beautiful. And they know it is. This place is known, many places in the world, for its quality of life. That's what we can use to bring this industry back. But we've got to be ready for it. I ask you to have that responsibility. When you go into the voting booth, to look at the candidates and decide which one is the most qualified to work for your family. I'm asking you for this job. I'm asking you to vote and hire me on May 8th. Thank you.